One of the most towering figures in economic theory is John Maynard Keynes. His ideas are still championed by many on the left today.
So friend of the show, Zach Carter's new book, The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. He looks at the man behind those economic theories, along with how the times he lived in shaped his ideas and how they might apply to today. Zach is a senior reporter at the Huffington Post. He joins us now via Skype to discuss his very highly reviewed book.
That's right.
Zach,
he's got it propped up there on the mantelpiece.
Yeah.
They just landed there. I don't know how they got there.
Zach, I know you've joined us on the show a little bit before, and of course we're talking about on a day 1.5 million additional unemployment claims. The economy really is it's in a crater right now. What can we learn a little bit about from your book and apply to the lessons of today if Washington was willing to actually listen?
Well, I mean, that last part is a really important caveat because it seems to me that over the course of this crisis, Washington has not had their eye on the crisis itself, but has been worried about all sorts of other distractions. With Keynes, he is a figure who is remembered as an economist because his legacy has sort of been passed down to us by the economics profession. But he didn't really dream of being an economist. He studied mathematics at Cambridge. His friends when he was growing up were people like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, people like Virginia Woolf, these great artists and philosophers. And he thought of himself as a social thinker. He didn't want to be remembered as the guy who was a genius about money and numbers and deficit spending. He wanted to be remembered as somebody who grappled with the great social problems of his day. And in his day, those problems were World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. Today, I think we're looking at a different set of problems: climate change, the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China, the breakdown of the European Union. Those are the big problems that Keynes would be focused on. And in this immediate moment, I think he'd be focused on the pandemic itself, how to deal with it as a public health issue. He kind of reversed engineered his economic ideas from the social problems that he believed needed to be addressed and the strategies and tactics that he thought would be necessary to address those social problems. And he kind of came up with the theory, not quite on the fly, because of course he worked on these great works of economic theory for decades, but he worked on them in order to deal with what he thought of as a broader social problem. He didn't separate economics from social policy the way we typically do now. He didn't see economics as this sort of like technical thing that was separate from the goals of creating a harmonious society and a decent world order.
Yeah, related to that, we covered this actually earlier in light of those unemployment claims still at 1.5 million, higher than expected, same essentially as last week. So even this far into the pandemic, you still have millions of people filing for unemployment. We showed a video of a mile-long line of people waiting outside the Kentucky State Capitol to try to talk to someone about getting unemployment benefits. I mean, how do you think that he would evaluate the response of the government to this whole situation?
Well, it's always a risky business to resurrect the dead and interrogate them. But I think in this case, Keynes was pretty clear throughout his life, regardless of what his particular economic worldview was, because he changed his views about economic strategy many, many times over the course of his life. But he believed that the government had to be bold, that there was no way to address big problems like he saw during his lifetime without robust government action. Society wasn't just going to work these things out on its own. Human beings weren't just sort of naturally wired toward progress, and big problems required big solutions. So I think he would look at this and say, this is a completely disastrous response. Right. We have millions of people out of work. We have people protesting in the streets. Keynes was a very he was a very frightened man in many respects. He was terrified of social unrest, and he spent most of his life trying to sort of keep it down, saying that we need to make sure that we don't have people rioting in the streets. I think he would look at the United States today, where we have protest movements in every city and mass unemployment, and say, I mean, that's a failure. I mean, how do you say this is a success?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me reading your book, Zach, was about the formative experiences for Keynes in World War I and in the Great Depression. So obviously we're in the middle of a Great Depression now. Are you optimistic in any way that maybe we'll learn the future, Keynes or whomever, the new thinking is emerging as a result of this crisis, the way that it did then, to inform maybe how we govern ourselves in the future?
Look, I think optimism is an essential characteristic of democracy. If you don't believe that tomorrow can be better than today, and don't have some sort of faith in the future, self-government as a project is just not going to work. So I'm kind of a congenital optimist. I always think that we can solve the problems that are before us, and it's one of the reasons why I have an affinity for Keynes. I mean, the man has all sorts of flaws, and as a policymaker in particular, he was just a failure for the vast majority of his life. He kept putting forward grand proposal after grand proposal and having them shot down all the way until World War II, frankly, which was the calamity he was trying to prevent. He didn't want World War II to have to happen. So he was kind of a failure, but he was always an optimist. And I think, I don't know, I see all these people in the streets, and I think, I've thought the last decade has been a pretty bad decade. I have not felt great about American government or the way that it has treated its citizens. And this moment right now just feels like people responding to a government that doesn't respond to them. It seems like people are saying enough is enough. And I think there's reasons to be hopeful about that. There's also reasons to be careful. When you have people in the streets, a lot of the stuff that's been happening in some of these protests is not great. But for the most part, I'm really excited about the prospects for American democracy right now.
I actually feel the same way. I find the protest movement one of the most hopeful things that I've seen recently, because I had this fear that people were just so apathetic, despondent, nihilistic, that they wouldn't be galvanized to get out in the street and demand change. So I feel the same way that you do, Zach. I also wanted to ask you about, sort of the most basic interpretation of Keynesian economic theory is you spend, even if it's deficit spending, during an economic downturn to try to turn things around. You get money into people's pockets so that they spend it, so that you stimulate the economy. How does that intersect with the ideas in modern monetary theory?
I think, look, I don't want to speak for every MMTer, but I'm friends with a lot of these people. I have a lot of respect for Stephanie Kelton in particular. At some points when they get into really technical stuff about how Federal Reserve operations work, I'll be honest, I get a little bit lost. And I study economics. This is what I do. So these are smart people. But my understanding of the theory in the approach is that it's a particular strain of Keynesian thinking. They're focused on the real resources of society, whether we have enough, pigs and cows and wheat and sheep to make the economy function, to make it work, and that the discussion of debt and deficits that are held by governments is sort of a distraction to this broader project of whether we have enough stuff and enough workers to make things actually happen. And I think that is very much in line with the kind of economics that Keynes was working on in the second half of his career. In 1942, I believe, he wrote this brilliant essay where he said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Because to afford something is just to be able to do it. You don't have to worry about governments running out of money. You have to worry about governments running out of resources. And I think the MMT people are doing a great job refocusing economic conversation on what it is the economy is and what it's supposed to do, away from these talks about sort of, accounting identities that I think have been used sometimes in good faith, but sometimes not in good faith, to prevent policies from being implemented that would actually solve the social problems that we face.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute analysis of that. Well, Zach, thank you so much for coming back on, and I really encourage everybody to read the book. I read it; it's fantastic, and couldn't recommend it enough.
Congrats, Zach! It's phenomenal and reviewed incredibly well, and I'm excited to read it too.
Thanks so much, guys. I'm a huge fan of the show.
Mutual admiration society. Thank you, Zach.
All right, coming up, the tech clash. It continues growing against Google and other tech organizations. We're going to tell you about the latest efforts to reform something called Section 230 when Rising continues.